Before we get started, just know that you can build all 7 of these small gift ideas that you're going to see in this video. And as a bonus, I'm going to make everything out of the scrap wood that I've got left over from the year's builds. The first few are going to be super easy, with the last ones becoming a little bit more advanced. But do stick around, because the very last one, I think that's super cool. So let's get the scrap wood out and let's get started. No, not YouTuber scrap wood, proper scrap wood. Let's be honest from the get-go, you're not going to have the same scrap wood as me. We haven't been building the same things. And this year, for the first time, I seem to be left with a load of long, thin strips, rather than the nice, easy-to-use boards. I did find a few interesting pieces like these round offcuts from my dog bowl holder that I made a while ago, and some olive wood that I brought back from Greece. I'm not even sure what that'll look like when it's actually finished, but I had my holiday optimism turned right up. And genuinely, I did start this with 15 build ideas, and I've then let the wood dictate which ones are actually possible. So if you are planning on making any of your holiday gifts this year, even if they're not exactly the ones that I'm making in this video, hopefully there'll be a few hints and tips along the way that you can make use of. Like this one. Do all your panel glue ups right at the very start. That way they can cure while you start making other things. One of those other things being that I'm going to rip down some of the thicker pieces first, so that I can really stretch out my scraps. And just know, if I had a bandsaw, I'd be using it, and it would be a lot safer than what you see me doing. I could even have sent it through my thickness planer, but I was worried about losing too much wood. But this is kind of a handy time to say, every process that you see me do in this video is a choice that I've made. It's not a lesson. Don't copy me blindly, I'm just showing you the possibilities and the choices I've made. And as always, if it doesn't feel safe, don't do it. Find a better, safer way. Okay, panel making. So when the build needs more wood than you actually have, just glue some together. But make a few interesting changes. Don't try and match like for like woods. Try contrasting, just to keep things interesting. Arrange the wood, well, how you like. Find out what you like. You may need to straighten a few edges to joint them together, but honestly, even that isn't that hard. You can use a hand plane or a well set up table saw. But overall, this skill is one of the foundations of scrap wood builds. You may not have the perfect size and shape pieces to build from, but you can make them. And like any panel glue up, ensuring that the sides don't cup, well, that's pretty easy too. I'm just showing you the 2 ways that I like to use. Cauls are the easiest, so long as you have some to hand, wrap them in tape to stop them gluing themselves to the actual piece. And you may not see it here at first, but the strips that I'm using are all different sizes. I'm just ensuring that through the middle they all line up, so when the clamps come off and I plane them down to size, I will get a decent thickness out of them. Right, that's the prep work done. Let's get on with the first build. I promised to start simple, and this is genuinely the simplest of them all. 4 battens, 4 magnets, and whatever features you want to add. My only technical aim here is to match the pieces into 2 pairs, but honestly, you don't really need to even do that. This is just a great creative build, although mine will actually be about as boring as you can get. The only criteria that I found it's best to stick to is that the pieces are all of equal length. And there's many ways of achieving this. I'm using a stop block on my fancy Hongdui mitre fence, but you could use a sled or a handsaw. A quick sand later, which I refuse to show you fully, and you're ready to start the last part. Really, this is one of the only technical bits. I'm marking to ensure that when I drill the holes, they're going to meet perfectly. For that, I love these combination squares. They're one of my every build tools. Just ensure that when you're using them as a reference, you're referencing off the top faces on both pieces. And then these markings are going to be where we drill our locations for countersinking some magnets. I'm aiming here just to get the magnets a hair below the surface, and it's why I'm using this handy depth gauge. But so long as you're careful, you could sneak up on a good fit. Now, if you have a look in the description, you'll see that there's a link for these magnets and some of the tools that I've used throughout all of these builds, just in case you want to go and buy some for yourself to use. I found that when you buy magnets, they can be a little bit hit and miss. In my experience, these are one of the strongest that I've found for the size. Oh yeah, and set the polarity so they draw towards each other rather than opposing each other. And then you're done. In truth, this gift it's just a blank canvas in many ways. You can make them any shape or size you like, carve them, shape them, engrave them. But what are they? Well, they're the simplest picture frames you're ever going to make. Just screw or stick one part of this to the wall and let the magnets do the rest. And if you find on smaller pictures it's slipping, just put a bit of this sticky back felt or rubber in between the 2 pieces. They'll still stick, but they'll grip the page really nicely. I think these are brilliant, super simple and easy to rotate the artwork, so you never get a boring wall. But now Now let's level it up a bit. For this next one, I had to do a couple of test cuts to get the angle right. But in truth, within a certain range, you can't go too far wrong. And no, you can also do this on a circular saw. And I got a little lucky here. I happened to have one of my scrap pieces that was a nicely sanded bit of hardwood. Pallet wood, I think. And all I've done is make one angle cut and then cut the other piece off square. So what I'm left with is just these two small pieces. But importantly, each one has a matching angle on one end and a 90-degree angle on the other. And for fun, I've just squared off the remaining wood as I realised I had enough to make a matching set of saws. I'm being a little bit cryptic, I know. But honestly, it's not all that complicated. You just need to take your two angled pieces and with the angles parallel, glue them onto the square that was left over. Leave a small gap in the middle and don't glue right up to the edge as the squeeze out is an absolute pain to get out of the groove. And that's about it. If you're lucky enough to have a piece remaining, well, take that and sand the heck out of it. Give it a really nice finish. And then once the glue's cured, you can cut off all the excess and square everything up nicely. For the end grain, I'm just using a saw, and then the long grain I use a hand plane. Sand off any sharp points, but take care not to angle the sides when you finish sand them. It's really easily done, and it kind of leads me to one of my main points, or ideas, advice, I don't know what you'd call it, but it's one of the takeaways from the video, I guess. There are hundreds of videos out there, all talking about homemade gifts and things you can sell. What I don't hear often about builds as simple as all of these is that if you take one extra step, you can add some serious wow factor. And genuinely, it is usually just one simple step. And it's one that's easily missed out as we all rush to finish the job at hand. So come on, don't leave all the wow to the complicated high-skill builds. Take this end grain for instance. It's an absolute pain to sand and to get a nice finish on. It certainly takes a little while. But if you take your time and that extra step, then it is a thing of beauty. You can polish it, especially with hardwood, until it almost feels like stone. And as we go on, I'm going to point out some super simple extra steps. Little things that you can do to elevate these really simple builds. This, in case you hadn't noticed, is a really simple phone stand and matching coaster. For finish, I like to use an oil or a wax oil for coasters. I'm told it's better than using varnish or lacquer. And it looks nice too, which helps. Right, let's move up a gear. So the laminated strips are now out of clamps and in need of flattening. And honestly, this is still my favourite job of all. But more than that, it actually gave me a good idea, extra steps. First, keep a few of these shavings. The two tones from the light and the dark wood make it a brilliant packing material. It's a lovely personalised gift touch. And once the board's flat, you can go ahead if you like and just chop it into squares. And that's fine. Don't scrimp on the sanding and the finishing touches. And you'll end up with a simple but lovely gift. But why not take it one step further? Why not make something truly unique? I've just set up a stop block on my mitre fence so I can cut this board down into strips. Having the block attached to the fence means that while using the mitre gauge, you're not running the risk of the wood snagging with the fence, because that's a big no-no. How wide you make the cut will dictate how thick the finished coaster is going to be. And because we flip them and expose that end grain, you can make the pattern whatever you want it to be. And then just glue them together, side grain to side grain. A quick tip here, I want to apply the clamping pressure so it is perfectly in line with the coaster. This is going to avoid any risk of bending from the pressure of the clamps. So I've used my clamps along the side so I can line up the bar to make sure it's perfectly parallel with the coaster itself. And then, well, if you're going to sand these flat, get comfortable. End grain's not like side grain. It's hard and it takes a lot of sanding. And whatever you do, don't send these through the thickness planer. That's going to make a very dangerous frisbee. It's far easier right now to pick up a hand plane. And in case you didn't know, here's a few tips to help you get the best results. But this first one will sound obvious, but have a freshly sharpened iron in your hand plane. Take the finest shavings you can. You can't flatten these in one or two passes. Take your time. Angle the plane to the piece so that you're slicing, not bludgeoning. And all of this reduces the risk of your tear out. Because on one of these where the fibres are vertical, any tear out is going to be a chunk, not just a small chip. If you find that you're struggling to get your plane perfectly set up and you're still getting tear out, don't worry. Just pop a small chamfer along the back edge. That way the last fibres you hit aren't going to be the unsupported ones at the back. And the end result, well, the end result will be lovely. Kind of like a mini chopping board. I've finished these two ways so you can see and choose for yourselves. On the left is the hard wax oil, and on the right I've sprayed on some lacquer. You choose which one you like. And now, on to the next one. You might say this next build's a bit of an odd one, only because I'm not actually going to show you the basics. This is a prototype pen pot, and I didn't honestly think that it would work first time. You see, having two different angles to consider was actually hurting my brain. But in truth, all you need is a jig. Well, that and someone to have already worked out how to make the jig. And someone who's made a video about it explaining it to you. So first of all, thank you Woby Designs. I'm going to leave a link down below in the description, just below the subscribe button, to Woby Designs video. It's where he talks you through making the jig and how to use it. It'd be wrong of me to imply that I have created or am adding anything to this actual build. It's all his work. He even gives away free printable plans that you can use to make the jig. And honestly, once you have the jig, it's both easy and accurate. You see, with the jig made, the first thing you need to do is just run a groove close to the bottom of your board for the base to sit in. Then, set your blade at 60 degrees, that's 30 on the handle. You position the board on the first part of the jig in a way that the groove faces down and is closest to you, and then cut an angle on one end. Place the board, angle pointing in and groove down and away from you this time in the next part of the jig, and then cut again. A little tip here. If you want your grain to wrap around the piece, number each one as it comes off. And then just repeat. To glue it up, I'm using painter's tape, and the printable plan even comes with a little base template. Super easy. One quick tip, due to the angle of the sides, don't cut the groove the identical thickness of your base piece. Either chamfer the base piece or cut a groove slightly wider, because you're going to need it. And what's the extra step, I hear you ask? Well, that's simple. Avoid a mistake that I made. Take your time to tape the lines on the edges of your glue joints. Then any squeeze out that you get on the inside won't be an absolute pain to clean up, or at least clean it with a wet cloth at the time. I didn't do any of that and I'm still kicking myself. You get your angles right and the joints are going to be nice and tight. Oh, and if you have rubber bands, that is the absolute best way to clamp this together. And the reason I'm breaking my rule here and showing you a tiny amount of the sanding is to show you that you don't need to flatten the bottom. The angle that the side's leaning creates a bit of an angle on the base. But I actually really love this feature as it gives you a lovely shadow line at the bottom of each of these pots. And yes, remember those choices we said at the start. You can be better than me and you can use this jig with the crown guard still on your table saw. The jig leaves plenty of room for it. And now for the extra step of sorts. Well, in truth, once you've got your setup going, create a little bit of a mass production line. Don't just make one. I'm really happy with how the olive wood pot came out. But then I remembered when I ripped the boards down at the very start of this project that I had a lot of thin scraps. So I decided to make quite a few more pots. And they all came out brilliantly, except for one thing. If you're going to make smaller pots, for some reason, maths, the base needs to be slightly smaller too. I couldn't wrap my head around it. So as you can see, I've made a few extras. And again, the ones on the left I've applied a wax oil to, and the ones on the right I've applied lacquer to. And you might see one of these a little bit later as a +1 for a different project. But you'll have to wait for that. And now, well, now for something far less fun. Well, it's a failure and a success story rolled into one. First, the success. You remember those circular offcuts that I had from, well, 10 minutes ago? Well, job one was the extra step straight away. Full sanding with double focus on the end grain. It's far easier to do it now than later, trust me. And then for the next part, you need a router and the ability to use it. Muppet. You can use any size straight cut bit you like. I'm using a 1/2 inch one here. And I'm starting off with just the tiniest amount exposed. Mine are fairly low quality, so this just helps me avoid any tear out. With the wood stuck to my workbench, I'm just going to make a groove straight down the middle. It's janky, but I've just taped a bit of this straight off cut as a guide. Don't forget to account for the width of your base here. The aim is to do around 3 or 4 passes and end up with a groove just over half the depth of the wood. And then mark and groove out another on the opposite side at a right angle to the first. That's going to leave you with a hole right in the middle where they intersect. Now, well, I've cut out all the upcoming footage of me failing, but I promise I'll show you that a little bit later. Let's stick to what works first. And this method came about from a desperate internet search after the failure. A search that led me to the Instagram account of TacoCraft. And like Woby Designs earlier, I want to give full credit, so you'll find a link to his Instagram down below. The basics though are that you need a runner the width of the first groove that you cut, but not as deep. And you need to glue it to a base with the screw holes made in the right places so you can fit that then to your router. Then run the runner in the first groove to create another, then another, so on and so on. Make sure the runner is at a distance from the bit to leave a good space so that you end up with a better fit than me. In truth, my last groove is a little bit close to the edge. But what you have at the end of all this is a lovely trivet. Before this build, I genuinely didn't know what a trivet was either. Anyway, maybe we don't need to see the failure. So I guess we do need to see it. Great. Okay, so here it is, and looking now, I can see so many mistakes. Firstly, sticking a thin strip to the router table. It was never going to hold, though even at this stage of showing off the progress, I genuinely thought it would. And then it didn't. And the inevitable happened. But I didn't stop there. I decided I was going to make the trivet smaller to hide the error. Cut it off. I happened to actually have a laser cut circle the perfect size for the job, so I hacked off the excess with a jigsaw. Wonderful camera work, I know. Then I took it over to be flush trimmed by the router in the router table. And yes, I know how silly this all is right now. So many places for the cutter to catch, especially the tiny diameter of this flush cut bit. So yes, I mangled it again and again and again. So now I have yet another coaster, and not a pretty one. But as a positive, I do have a lovely trivet too. So my extra step here was just not giving up when the first method failed. That counts, right? I promised you on this last build we're going to do something that I think is quite special. But don't worry, it's actually still very doable. But the first big tip here, prepare your wood while it's in its flattest, largest form. You're going to find it much easier to sand the board down to somewhere near about 100 grit to at least get you started before you start chopping it up. And to make all of these cuts on the table saw, we're going to use the one angle blade, the same angle throughout. Why? Well, I'm going to show you at the end and I'm going to see if you agree. I did a few test cuts to make sure I was getting the angle right, and then I left the blade set at that angle for the whole of the build. And you can absolutely do this with a circular saw. In fact, I'm going to link the video down below where I made a dog bowl holder using this exact method and a circular saw. The first angle cut just cleans up one edge and the second cleans up the other. Note, these aren't parallel cuts, they're actually opposing cuts. The next cut does need to be parallel with the first, and then you've created the upright section of this build, which is the larger of the two. You're going to see at the end though that the size is entirely flexible depending on what you want to use it for. What that cut also does is leave you with the base part, which has opposing angles, which I think makes it look nicer. Again, you'll see. And then as a last minute decision, I decided to quickly trim off a tiny slice that we're going to use for later. Totally unnecessary. So don't change the angle of your saw blade here. We're just going to drop it down, do a couple of test cuts to make sure that the depth for our groove cut is right. And then what we're going to do now is exactly the same as just cutting a dado, just with an angle blade. You're going to have to make quite a few passes here, and don't use a dado stack because that will give you an entirely different result. Sneak up on the perfect fit, and I mean genuinely sneak up. When you get close, just cut a hair off each time. A cut too many and the fit here is going to be far too loose. This is about right because it leaves just enough room for glue. You will be left with a little bit of cleanup to get rid of some of the scratches and grooves left from the blade, and then we can see what we're working with. There's two features that we're trying to accentuate through this build. One is the matching angles created by having the saw blade set at one distinct angle, and the other is the grain that runs throughout this piece. Both are simple, but really pleasing to look at. And in truth, this could be the start of many projects. Standing photo frame, book stand, cookbook stand, tablet stand, anything with stand in the name, really, within reason. But I still want to take those extra steps I talked about. First, I want a nice smooth channel along the front, and that's why I'm using this coving bit. I'm marking out with some blue tape where I should stop and start because I don't want to come out both ends. Stop blocks would actually have been perfect here. I'm also taking 2 passes to go easy on the bit. That's going to take a little bit of cleanup later, but let's do all of the routing first. And with that in mind, we're going to do a couple of features for the upright section. What I was going for here is to create 2 through cuts, each coming from the side to around about 1/3 of the way in. And in hindsight, there are better ways to do this. You'll see. The shallow pass to start with went fine. I even took 2 more passes, raising the bit just a touch each time. And then the final pass finishes the job. Hey, where did that go? Was nothing like what I said at the time. And before you ask, yes, it happened on both sides. But believe it or not, it was actually a blessing in disguise. I'm going to show you a clever fix that I have for that in a second. First, I need a couple of grooves on the base piece, more extra steps. These are simpler because they don't have to go all the way through. Another tip though, set up a stop block. The first pass is fine, but the second pass on the router, if the bit grabs onto the wall of the first pass, it can whip the piece out of your hand if you're not careful. And then the last few tweaks. I'm using CA glue for instant grab and then wood glue for strength. And I'm leaving a gap on this ledge that I'm putting in for, well, you've probably figured it out by now. And then I'm just going to throw grain direction of wood movement to the wind, and I'm going to add this nice strip of sapele to the front. I know I haven't shown you every cut and every detail for now. It may look complicated and it may look like you need a fair few tools. But in truth, you don't actually need to cut the groove that holds the two pieces together. You could just glue and screw them together if you wanted to. But let me show you how mine came out and how I fixed my little breakage. Well, as you can see, my fix was, I didn't fix it. I'm going to level with you here. This gift, well, I set out to make something for me. And I love all of the extra steps that I've put in because there's some little features in this that I think are really handy. The groove across the front, perfect for a pen. I'm sure you'll have figured this out by now that the little shelf is for your phone, and the gap, well, that's for a charger. And you remember the two through cuts that I made? Well, that is so the cable for the charger can come through and be hidden around the back. I've also added this little clipboard element because I tend to be quite forgetful and I love making lists. But where I had the fun is when you flip it around, because the two grooves on the side, well, they're for coasters. I tend to always have a cup of tea on the go while I'm editing. And then finally, one of these pen pots sits nicely behind and hidden by the upright. But I've taken an extra step with this because I've put a magnet on the bottom of it. That way, if I knock this, it's not going to spill everywhere and put pens all over my desk. And keeping it in place is super simple. I've just been really careful and I've sunk another magnet in from the base. So when the pot gets close, it locks into place. This is a project like all others that you can customize to suit you or the person you're buying it for perfectly. But the one thing to remember is to keep those features that are pleasing to the person looking at it. The fact that the angle on the table saw is the same throughout means that the angle on the front is the same as the angle in the back, is the same as the angle of the upright, and in turn is the same as the angle on the top. So when you look at this piece, the top is perfectly flat. You can see all that beautiful end grain. And I genuinely think that having all the same angles on a piece like that without overdoing it means that somebody just taking a glance at it without inspecting it too heavily will not know why they like it, but they will. And then having the grain running down the top and across the back all adds to the aesthetics of the piece. And so there it is, a load of gifts made from nothing more than a little bit of scrap wood. I'm going to leave you with one last bit of advice that I'm sure most of you already know, but still bears repeating. If you make your gifts this year, no matter what they are, no matter who they're for, when you give them, just remember 90% of people can't do what you do. They won't be looking for flaws or blemishes, so there's really no need to point them out. Hand over the gift with pride, safe in the knowledge that they will love whatever you've made for them. And don't forget, I'm always on the lookout for new beginner-friendly builds to show you guys. So if you've got any, pop them in the comments. Thanks a lot for watching. Remember to be kind to yourself, and I'll see you on the next one.